Picture this, a raw spring morning in 1899, April 15th to be exact, when smoke began curling from the basement furnace of a wooden palace perched on 900 acres of Long Island riverfront, and within hours the entire structure, 110 rooms of queen and splendor, 20 years of accumulated treasures, the carefully curated stage set for social acceptance, would be reduced to chimneys standing like tombstones over ash, and inside, scrambling through smoke-filled corridors in their nightclothes, were William Kissam Vanderbilt Jr., barely 20 years old, and his new bride Virginia, Bertie, Fair, on what was supposed to be their honeymoon, a beginning that instead marked an ending, because what burned that morning was not merely wood and plaster but the illusion that anything built by new money could ever truly be permanent, that speed and wealth could ever substitute for time and pedigree. That 11 months of frenzied construction, yes, just 11 months from groundbreaking to occupancy, in 1878 to 1879, could create something that would last, and here's the dark truth that the flames illuminated with brutal clarity: idle hour, the very name a performance of aristocratic leisure, had always been a desperate gamble, a monument to the Vanderbilt family's most painful vulnerability, their status as outsiders trying to buy their way into a world that despised them. And the fire that morning was simply making visible what had always been true, that new money burns, that acceptance is fragile, that the invisible machinery of class operates according to rules that no amount of railroad millions can ever fully master, and as young Willie K. and Bertie ran from room to room, the flames chasing them through corridors they'd barely had time to learn, through a building that was supposed to represent their future, their inheritance, their place in the American aristocracy, they were living out in condensed form the entire trajectory of Gilded Age ambition, the frantic scramble, the desperate flight, the inevitable confrontation with forces beyond their control, the discovery that everything they'd been promised was made of wood and paint and could disappear in an instant, leaving nothing but smoke and memory, and the bitter knowledge that safety was always an illusion, that permanence was always a lie, that the mansions their families built were not fortresses but funeral pyres waiting for a spark. But let us go back to where this story truly begins, not in the flames but in the marriage that preceded them by just 3 years, April 20th, 1875, when a 22-year-old woman named Alva Erskine Smith, daughter of a ruined Southern cotton broker, daughter of genteel poverty and faded lineage, stood in a modest ceremony and married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore. And if you think this was a love match, then you've never understood what marriage meant in the Gilded Age. Alva herself would later admit without shame that she married Willie K. for money, that it was a transaction designed to save her family from bankruptcy and herself from obscurity, and Willie K., for his part, got a wife with impeccable taste, iron will, and social ambition that made Napoleon look diffident, a woman who would spend the next 2 decades dragging the Vanderbilt name from the realm of new money swells into something approaching respectability, and their weapon of choice was architecture, specifically the kind of extravagant, impossible, statement-making architecture that screamed both, "We have arrived," and "We are desperate for you to acknowledge it, because you have to understand the context, the world into which they were trying to force themselves." New York society in the 1870s was ruled by Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor, who with her social arbiter Ward McAllister had created the 400, supposedly the number of people who could fit in her ballroom but really the number of people she deemed worthy of acknowledgement, and these 400 were old money, Knickerbocker families, descendants of Dutch settlers and colonial merchants, people whose fortunes were 3 or 4 or 5 generations old and who looked at the Vanderbilts the way you might look at something unpleasant tracked in on your shoe, because Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the founder of the fortune, had been a ferryman, a rough-spoken, poorly educated, utterly ruthless businessman who built his empire through steamships and railroads and stock manipulation and didn't give a damn what anyone thought of him, and his fortune by his death in 1877 was estimated at $105 million, more than was held in the U.S. Treasury at the time, 1/87th of the entire nation's GDP, a concentration of wealth so extreme it was obscene, and it had all been made in a single generation, which meant it was tainted, which meant the family would spend the next generation trying to wash away the stain of its own success, trying to transform railroad money into something that looked like inherited gentility, and this was the task that Alva took upon herself with a fervor that bordered on religious mania. And so in 1878, barely 3 years into their marriage, Willie K. and Alva began construction on Idle Hour, their hunting retreat on Long Island's South Shore, 900 acres of prime riverfront on the Connecticut, land purchased from the South Side Sportsman's Club, and they hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, the man who would become the official architect of new money's transformation into cultural legitimacy, who had already designed the Vanderbilt Petit Chateau on 5th Avenue at 52nd Street, and Hunt designed them a wooden palace in the Queen Anne style, all towers and gables and decorative shingles, irregular rooflines and varied textures, the aesthetic of picturesque asymmetry that was supposed to suggest English country houses and ancient lineage, 110 rooms of it spread across 3 stories, with accommodations for family and guests and all the elaborate infrastructure required for a Gilded Age estate, dining rooms and drawing rooms, and libraries and conservatories, billiard rooms and gun rooms and service wings, quarters for dozens of servants and stables for the horses and all the outbuildings required for a sporting estate, because this was not just a house but a complete theatrical production, a stage set for the performance of aristocratic ease, and here's where the title of our story bites down: they built it in 11 months. 11 months from breaking ground to opening the doors to guests, and you have to understand what this timeline meant. It meant hundreds of workers, many of them Irish and Italian immigrants, fresh off the boats from Ellis Island, desperate for wages, willing to accept almost any conditions, working in shifts that lasted from before dawn until after dark. It meant timber being cut and milled and installed while the paint from the previous room was still drying. It meant plaster going up over studs that hadn't fully dried. It meant finishing work being done by candlelight. Because there was no electrical lighting yet, it meant no weekends, no holidays, no mercy for human exhaustion, no consideration of safety beyond the bare minimum required to keep the workforce functional. It meant corners cut and quality sacrificed to speed, because what mattered wasn't that the house would last forever but that it would be ready for this season, this summer, this particular social moment when invitations needed to be extended and acceptances secured, when the Vanderbilts needed to announce that they had arrived, that they had a country estate, that they were players in the great game of American aristocracy. And the workers who built it, whose names we do not know, whose children we cannot trace, whose bodies absorbed sawdust and exhaustion and injuries that went unrecorded in any newspaper, they understood something that Willie K. and Alva could never quite grasp, that the desperation that drove this 11-month construction timeline was itself a confession of illegitimacy, that old money never hurries because old money has time, that the Astors and the Livingstons and all those moldering Knickerbocker families with their 3-century pedigrees would look at Idle Hour and see not a triumph but a symptom, evidence of the same grasping nouveau riche panic that characterized everything the Vanderbilts touched. And there's a particular cruelty in this because the workers, who had nothing, who owned nothing, who would never own anything, could see what the Vanderbilts with all their millions could not. That acceptance is not for sale, that legitimacy cannot be constructed in 11 months or 11 years or 11 generations, that the game is rigged from the start, designed to keep the new money running faster and faster on a treadmill that leads nowhere, and yet they built it anyway, these workers, because what choice did they have? Because wages were wages and hunger was hunger. And so they hammered and sawed and plastered and painted, working through heat and cold, through accidents and exhaustion, and when it was done, when the 11 months had produced this vast wooden palace on the Connecticut, they moved on to the next job, the next mansion, the next monument to someone else's insecurity, carrying in their bodies the cost that never appeared in any ledger, the cost of crushed fingers and strained backs and lungs full of sawdust, and the knowledge that they had built something beautiful and substantial that they themselves would never be allowed to enter except as servants, except as the invisible machinery that made the visible spectacle function. And what did Willie K. and Alva get for their 11 months of frenzy, for the invisible labor and the visible expenditure? They got a country house, a hunting lodge really, somewhere to escape from New York scrutiny and play at being English country squires, somewhere to entertain in a more relaxed fashion than the formal torture chambers of Fifth Avenue. An Idle Hour was designed for exactly this performance of casual aristocracy. There were rooms for hunting equipment, stables for horses, grounds for shooting, access to the Connecticut River for fishing and yachting, all the apparatus of the sporting life that the British gentry had perfected and that American millionaires now frantically imitated, hoping that by copying the outward forms they might somehow inherit the inward certainty. And the estate was positioned opposite another grand property, Westbrook, the Bayard cutting estate, creating a kind of millionaire's row along the river, a concentration of wealth and pretension that must have seemed to the local Oakdale residents like an invasion from another planet, because these were sums of money beyond ordinary comprehension, fortunes being spent on what was essentially vacation homes, second or third or fourth residences for people who already had more houses than they could possibly live in, and Willie K especially threw himself into the role of country gentleman. He was the sportsman Vanderbilt, the one who genuinely loved horses and yachts and later automobiles, who would establish the Vanderbilt Cup race in 1904, the first major international automobile race in America, who would build the Long Island Motor Parkway, the first limited-access highway in the world, who seemed to find in mechanical speed in sporting competition some relief from the suffocating pressure of social performance, and perhaps that's why idle hour mattered to him. Perhaps it was the one place where he could pretend that his wealth bought him actual leisure rather than just more elaborate forms of labor, more complex choreographies of social positioning, but even at idle hour the performance never stopped, couldn't stop, because the servants were watching, the other families were watching, the newspapers were watching, and every detail of how you lived became evidence in the perpetual trial of your social legitimacy. And the servants, oh the servants, we must talk about them because they are the invisible architecture beneath the visible one, the human machinery that made the mansion function, and at idle hour there would have been dozens of them, maids and footmen and cooks and grooms and gardeners and gamekeepers and laundresses and scullery maids and valets and ladies' maids, all wearing the Vanderbilt livery, maroon uniforms with gold buttons, all performing their roles in the great charade, and their working conditions, like those of the construction workers, have left only the faintest traces in the historical record, but we can reconstruct the likely reality from similar establishments of the period and from the occasional labor disputes that made it into the newspapers, 17-hour days starting before dawn to light fires and ending after midnight when the last dinner guest had been attended to, no days off except perhaps a half-day every other Sunday, wages that barely covered room and board, sleeping quarters in attics or basements, cramped and unheated, sharing beds and washing facilities, eating the scraps from the family's meals, wearing hand-me-down clothes dyed in the Vanderbilt colors, a rigid hierarchy below stairs that mirrored and perhaps exceeded in its cruelty the social stratification above, with the butler and housekeeper lording over the lower servants with absolute authority, meting out punishments and praise, controlling every aspect of their subordinates' lives, and beneath it all the knowledge, the certain knowledge, that they were not individuals but props, not people but furniture that happened to move and speak and serve, that any mistake, any moment of visibility, any failure to anticipate their employer's needs before those needs were even expressed, could mean instant dismissal without reference, without hope of future employment, without any safety net in an age before unemployment insurance or welfare or any of the structures that would later make such abject dependency slightly less terrifying, and so they performed. These invisible servants, they polished the silver until it gleamed, pressed the linens until they were crisp, served the dinners without a sound, cleaned the fireplaces and scrubbed the floors and maintained the gardens and exercised the horses and did 10,000 other tasks that no one acknowledged or thanked them for, and they never, ever complained within earshot of their employers, because to complain was to be dismissed, and to be dismissed was to face destitution, and so they swallowed their exhaustion and their resentment and their rage and kept the machinery of idle hour running smoothly, invisibly, perfectly, creating the illusion that wealth naturally produced ease, that mansions maintained themselves, that the Vanderbilts' leisure was simply the natural order of things rather than the product of dozens of people working themselves to exhaustion to sustain the fantasy. But let us return to the family drama unfolding above stairs, because this is a story about a marriage as much as a mansion, and the marriage was rotting from within even as the mansion rose from the ground, because Willie K., it turned out, did not share Alva's bottomless appetite for social climbing, did not find meaning in the endless performance of taste and cultivation, found the whole business of society tedious and artificial, and as the years wore on he began to spend more and more time away from Alva, more time with his yachts and his horses, more time in Paris where he could escape the suffocating respectability of New York and live according to his own desires, and there were rumors, persistent rumors that would eventually explode into scandal, about a mistress named Nellie Neustadter, a younger woman described in society gossip as notorious in Europe, and the details that leaked out were deliberately humiliating to Alva. Willie had dressed Nellie's French servants in the Vanderbilt livery, the same maroon uniforms with gold buttons, had set her up in a house in Paris and made no secret of the relationship, had essentially replicated his married life with a substitute wife while Alva remained in New York managing their social obligations, and Alva knew, of course she knew, had probably known for years, because how could she not know when the newspapers were full of hints and the society gossips were having a field day, but the knowledge was one thing and the public acknowledgement another, and for a time they maintained the fiction, kept up appearances, continued to appear together at social functions, continued to host at Idle Hour and at their other properties. Because divorce in the Gilded Age was social death, meant ostracization. Meant the end of everything Alva had spent 20 years building, and besides, there were the children to think of, Consuelo born in 1877, Willie K. Jr. born in 1878, and Harold born in 1884, and Alva was nothing if not a strategic thinker. A long-range planner who understood that her power derived from her marriage and her children and that both needed to be carefully managed and deployed for maximum advantage. But then something snapped, some final straw fell, some humiliation too great to be swallowed, and in December 1894 Alva filed for divorce on grounds of adultery, citing Willie's affair with Nellie Neustredder, and the newspapers went absolutely insane because this was not done, did not happen. Women of Alva's class did not leave their husbands no matter what private hells they endured, and the scandal was explosive. Front-page news for months, because here was Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who had spent 2 decades clawing her way into society, who had thrown the most famous party of the Gilded Age in 1883, who had finally forced Caroline Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilt existence, now throwing it all away, risking ostracization, public shame, social death, and for what? For pride, for dignity, for the refusal to continue tolerating what every other society wife tolerated without complaint. And there was something magnificent in her refusal, something that transcended the pettiness of society politics and touched on genuine human dignity, the assertion that she was a person, not a prop, that her feelings mattered, that she would not spend the rest of her life in a marriage that had become a public mockery, but there was also something ruthless in it, something calculating, because Alva was never just reacting, was always planning, and she had leverage. She had their daughter Consuelo, beautiful and young and marriageable and valuable, the perfect bargaining chip for an even more audacious social gambit, and so while the divorce ground through the courts, settled in March 1895 with a huge financial payout, reportedly over $10 million in contemporary dollars, equivalent to nearly $400 million today, giving Alva financial independence and ensuring that she could maintain her social position despite the scandal, Alva was already planning her next move. And that move was to marry Consuelo to European aristocracy, specifically to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, first cousin of Winston Churchill, a man with a title and a palace and crushing debts, a perfect candidate for one of those transatlantic marriages that had become so fashionable, American money purchasing European titles, new money buying old prestige. And if you want to understand the depths of Alva's ruthlessness, the lengths to which social ambition could drive even maternal feeling, you need to know that Consuelo was in love with someone else, a man named Winthrop Rutherford, handsome and charming and entirely appropriate except that he wasn't a duke, wasn't European royalty, couldn't give Alva what she really wanted, which was the ultimate validation of her social project, the transformation of Vanderbilt money into aristocratic legitimacy, and so Alva destroyed that relationship, forbade Consuelo from seeing Rutherford, intercepted their letters, locked Consuelo in her room when she threatened to rebel, threatened to kill herself if Consuelo didn't comply, manipulated and emotionally tortured her daughter with a cruelty that's hard to fathom even by the standards of Gilded Age parenting, and ultimately forced Consuelo into a marriage that would make her miserable for the next 25 years until she finally escaped through her own divorce in 1921, and Alva would later admit to an investigator, admit without apparent shame, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter," and what does it tell us about the Gilded Age that this abuse, this trafficking of a young woman for social prestige, was not only legal but admired, that people praised Alva for her ambition, that the wedding in November 1895 at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue was the social event of the decade, that the merger of American money and British titles was seen as the natural culmination of new money's transformation into something approaching respectability, and that Consuelo, 18 years old, walking down the aisle with tears streaming down her face, tears that everyone interpreted as tears of joy but that she would later reveal were tears of despair, was simply fulfilling her duty, playing her assigned role in the great performance, sacrificing her happiness for her mother's ambition, and nobody, not one person in that church, thought to ask whether this was right or whether this was simply another form of the same exploitation. That characterized everything about the Gilded Age, the same willingness to sacrifice human beings on the altar of social positioning, the same transformation of people into commodities, into assets to be deployed and traded and consumed. And through all of this, through the divorce and the scandal and Consuelo's forced marriage, Idle Hour stood, the wooden palace on the Connecticut, and Willie K. kept it in the settlement. It was his hunting lodge after all, his escape from the wreckage of his first marriage, and he continued to use it, continued to host parties there, continued to maintain the fiction of aristocratic leisure even as his personal life fell apart. And in 1899 his son, Willie K. Jr., now 20 years old, married Virginia Birdie Fair, daughter of James Graham Fair, who had made his fortune in Nevada's silver mines as one of the Bonanza Kings. Another new money match, another transaction between families of recent wealth, and the young couple chose Idle Hour for their honeymoon because what could be more romantic than a mansion on a river? What could promise a better beginning than all those rooms and all those acres and all that carefully cultivated aristocratic ambience? And they arrived in April. Springtime on Long Island, the estate at its most beautiful, the grounds beginning to green, the river running high, the promise of summer ahead, and they settled into the master bedroom suite, unpacked their honeymoon wardrobes, explored the rooms their father and grandfather had built, planned their lives together in this palace of wood and paint and desperate ambition, except of course that it was all built too fast, built in 11 months by exhausted workers, built from wood rather than stone, built without the fireproofing that more cautious builders might have insisted upon, built according to a timeline that prioritized speed over safety, appearance over substance, and so on April 15, 1899, at approximately 3 in the morning according to newspaper reports, a fire started in the basement furnace, likely from overheating, possibly from a spark finding its way into the structure's wooden bones, into the dried timber that had been installed too quickly, that hadn't had time to properly cure, that was essentially kindling waiting for a match, and once the fire started it moved fast, accelerated by the open staircases and ventilation shafts, fed by all that expensive wood paneling and silk wall coverings and tapestries and furniture, and the house that had taken 11 months to build took less than 5 hours to burn. And Willie K. Jr. and Bertie woke to smoke, to shouting, to the realization that the building was on fire, and they ran from wing to wing as the flames chased them, grabbing what they could, trying to salvage valuables, finally abandoning everything and fleeing outside in their nightclothes to watch from the lawn as the entire structure collapsed into itself, all 110 rooms, all the furniture and paintings and accumulated treasures of 2 decades, the library with its leather-bound volumes, the dining room with its silver service, the drawing rooms with their silk upholstery, the bedrooms with their tapestried walls, all of it feeding the flames, and the servants running out carrying what they could save, and the fire brigade arriving too late, the nearest fire station too far away, the water pressure too weak, the building too large, the fire too advanced, and so they could only watch as 20 years of Vanderbilt ambition turned to ash, as the symbol of their arrival burned down to chimneys standing like tombstones over ruins, and the symbolism was too perfect, too on the nose, the impermanence of wood revealing the impermanence of social position, the speed of construction mirrored in the speed of destruction, the desperate gamble of new monies. Architectural pretensions reduced in one night to ash and memory, and Willie K. Sr., when he got the news in Paris, when the telegram arrived informing him that Idle Hour had burned to the ground, that his son and daughter-in-law had barely escaped with their lives, that everything he had built there was gone, was reportedly devastated, not because of the financial loss. What were a few $1 million to a Vanderbilt? What was the cost of one mansion when the family owned a dozen? But because Idle Hour had been his, the one place that felt like home rather than stage set, the one possession that seemed to reflect his actual personality rather than his social obligations, the one escape from all of his relentless ambition and society's endless demands, and he vowed immediately to rebuild, but this time differently. This time he would build in brick and stone and steel, this time he would make it fireproof. This time nothing would burn, this time he would build something permanent. Something that would last, something that would finally, definitively, prove that the Vanderbilts were not just passing through, not just temporary residents of the American aristocracy, but permanent fixtures, solid and unmovable as the stones he would use to build. And so began the construction of the second idle hour, and this time there would be no 11-month sprint. This building would be done right, designed by Richard Howland Hunt, son of the original architect Richard Morris Hunt, who had died in 1895, in a vaguely English country house style, built starting in 1900 and completed in 1901. Constructed with 10-inch steel beams and concrete faced with 20-inch walls of brick and limestone, fireproof and substantial and meant to last 1,000 years. With ballrooms decorated in 24-karat gold leaf that caught the light and turned everything golden, with a main staircase of carved stone imported from France, with an oak library retrofitted from a French chateau, the actual paneling and shelving removed and shipped across the Atlantic and installed in Long Island, with a palm court constructed with 10 tons of glass creating a greenhouse effect, with an indoor tennis court because this was America and excess knew no bounds, with bachelors' quarters designed by Warren and Wetmore, the same firm that would later design Grand Central Terminal, because etiquette dictated that unmarried men couldn't sleep in the same wing as married couples, with stables full of horses attended by grooms imported from England because Willie Kay insisted on authenticity, with a bowling alley shipped over from England complete with moss-covered slates to give it an air of antiquity, though the workmen scraped the moss off not understanding its value, and Willie Kay had to send for another shipment of old mossed slate, with gardens and mazes and fountains and all the apparatus of a country estate, and when it was done, when the fireproof palace stood complete, critics looked at it and were decidedly underwhelmed, because for all its astronomical cost, for all its impressive fireproofing and architectural pedigree, there was something hollow about it, something that felt less like a home and more like a museum, a mausoleum even, all that stone and steel creating spaces that echoed, that felt cold, that lacked the warmth and life of the original wooden structure, and perhaps that was fitting because by the time the second idle hour was completed, the marriage that had built the first one was over, scattered like the ashes of the original structure, and Willie Kay himself would remarry. In 1903 to Anne Harriman Rutherford, yes, a relative of the Winthrop Rutherford that Consuelo had loved, one of those strange circularity that marks Gilded Age society where everyone was connected to everyone else in complicated webs of marriage and money, and then Willie Kay retired from business entirely, walked away from the family railroad empire at age 54, moved to France to pursue his real passion of breeding and racing horses, returning to America only during World War I when crossing the Atlantic became too dangerous and then going back to France after the war where he would die in Paris in 1920, and so the second idle hour, the fireproof palace, stood largely empty, used occasionally by Willie Kay's youngest son Harold who inherited it but found it more burden than blessing, a vast pile requiring dozens of servants and crushing maintenance costs, eating money at a rate that even a Vanderbilt fortune found burdensome, and after Willie Kay's death the attempts to sell it ended in foreclosure, twice, because who wanted a 70,000 square foot mansion on Long Island, who could afford to maintain such a thing, who had the staff and the money and the desire to keep up the performance that idle hour demanded? And an attempt to develop the estate for housing failed, because this was 1920s Long Island and there were limits even then to how many rich people wanted to live in subdivisions carved from Gilded Age estates, and eventually in 1926 the mansion and 26 acres were purchased by Mrs. Lucy Pritchard Thompson who established the Idle Hour Artists Community, converting the stables into apartments and selling lots to artists who moved in and created a bohemian enclave in the shadow of Gilded Age excess, and you have to appreciate the irony, the poetic justice really, of Willie Kay's palace of exclusivity becoming a haven for exactly the kind of creative individuals that Gilded Age society would have considered beneath notice, painters and sculptors and writers and performers, people who made art rather than money, people who valued expression over acquisition, people who lived in the former servants' quarters and stables while the main mansion stood empty and echoing, and among these artists were Harry Allen Weston and DeWitt Reed and George Elmer Brown and Neil Z. Bryan and Myron Van Brunt and Bronco Charlie Miller who had performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, bringing a piece of the authentic American frontier to this temple of fake European aristocracy, and the artist stayed for a decade, a brief flowering of actual creative life in a building that had been designed for the performance of leisure, and then in 1937 the mansion and carriage house were sold to the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, which sounds impressive until you realize it was a front for a cult led by a man named James Bernard Schaefer, a con artist and charlatan who attracted thousands of mostly middle-aged female followers with promises of spiritual enlightenment and eternal life through metaphysical study, taking their money and giving them nothing but fantasies. And in 1939 Schaefer adopted a 3-month-old baby girl he called Baby Jean and proclaimed he would give her eternal life through his own studies into metaphysics and a special diet of vegetables, claiming absurdly that the baby would be raised in the same nursery where Consuelo Vanderbilt had been raised, which was a lie. Consuelo grew up at the original Idlehour estate that burned, not at the later mansion, but Schaefer never let facts interfere with a good story, and he invited the press to photograph baby Jean and himself, generating publicity for his cult, and for a time it worked. People believed, sent money, joined the fraternity, moved into Idle Hour and surrounding properties, created a whole community based on Schaefer's metaphysical nonsense, until the scheme unraveled when the baby's mother sued and reclaimed her child, and then Schaefer was convicted of stealing from his followers, systematically robbing them of their life savings while promising them eternal life. And in 1942 he had to sell Idle Hour to cover legal costs, and he served time in prison, and he and his wife would later commit suicide together in 1955 while trying to start another cult at West Nyack. And what does it tell us? That this monument to Gilded Age respectability became first an artist's commune and then a cult headquarters. That the house Willie K built to proclaim his legitimacy ended up hosting the most marginal, desperate, and delusional members of American society. That the trajectory from railroad mansion to metaphysical fraud was somehow inevitable. That Idle Hour could never just be a house but was always a symbol, always performing meaning beyond its architecture, always attracting people who wanted to appropriate or subvert or exploit its associations with wealth and power. But the mansion's strange journey was not over. In 1947 it was purchased by National Dairy Research Labs, transformed from palace to laboratory, from site of social performance to site of scientific inquiry, and for a time the ballrooms where Willie K had entertained became laboratories where chemists studied milk proteins, where the gold leaf on the walls looked down on test tubes and microscopes, where the entire building was repurposed for something useful, something that actually contributed to human knowledge rather than just displaying human vanity. And then in 1963 it was bought by Adelphi University of Garden City and became the Suffolk campus, and in 1968 this became Dowling College, named after Robert Dowling who made his fortune in New York real estate. And finally the building had found a purpose. It was educating students, serving a public good, no longer the private preserve of millionaires but a place where working-class and middle-class Long Islanders could come to better their prospects, to get degrees, to transform their own lives through education rather than inheritance. And perhaps this was the redemption arc, perhaps this was how the story was supposed to end, with the mansion of excess transformed into an institution of opportunity, with the palace of exclusion becoming a center of inclusion, with the building that had been constructed to keep people out now bringing people in. And for 48 years it worked. Dowling College operated out of Idle Hour and other buildings on the estate, educated thousands of students, became part of the fabric of Long Island life, and the mansion's rooms that had once hosted society dinners now hosted lectures and seminars, and the ballroom where Willie K had danced became a library, and the whole building was repurposed and reimagined and given new life. Except that in March 1974, just 6 years after Dowling College began operations, at 3:10 in the morning, almost exactly 75 years after the first fire, almost the same time of night, as if the building were determined to reenact its own trauma, another fire broke out, this time in the student lounge, and despite Willie K's obsessive fireproofing, despite the steel beams and concrete and brick walls, despite everything he had done to make the building invulnerable to flame, the fire tore through the interior, destroyed the smoking room and the main staircase and those prized plasterwork ceilings and the dining room and living room and all the silk-lined and tapestried walls that had been restored after the first fire. And while the exterior survived, while the brick and stone and steel did their job and prevented complete collapse, the interior, the heart of the building, the decorative elements that gave it character and beauty, was gutted, and it took $3 million and 3 years to restore, and the restoration was incomplete. Many of the most exquisite details were simply gone, lost forever. The craftsmanship that had taken months to create burned away in hours, and what remained was a kind of ghost, the shell of grandeur with ersatz substitutes for the things that had made it special. And Dowling College used this compromised mansion for another 42 years, until 2016 when the college went bankrupt. Unable to pay off more than $50 million in debt, unable to compete with larger institutions, unable to maintain enrollments, unable to keep up with the changing economics of higher education, and the doors closed and the students scattered and the building stood empty again. And in 2018 it was purchased in bankruptcy proceedings by the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, approving the sale for $14 million to Mercury International LLC of Delaware, an affiliate of NCF Capital Limited, and that price, $14 million. For a 105-acre estate with a 70,000 square foot mansion, was less than one-tenth of what Willie K. had spent building the place, less than the contemporary value of a single year's maintenance costs during the Vanderbilt occupation, and Mercury International is a foreign entity, difficult to trace, unresponsive to community concerns, with no apparent plan for the property beyond holding it and letting it appreciate or decay, whichever comes first. And they have let it decay, let water damage spread through the compromised roof, let vandals and metal thieves strip the property of copper and brass and anything else of value, let time and weather do what two fires could not quite accomplish, and the mansion that Willie K. built to be fireproof, that was supposed to last forever, that was supposed to be the permanent proof of Vanderbilt legitimacy, now stands crumbling and abandoned. Windows broken, roof leaking, grounds overgrown, paint peeling, stone crumbling, a ruin in real time, and the local historical society and preservation groups are trying to save it, petitioning and fundraising and fighting a battle they are probably going to lose because there is no money for saving the monuments of the Gilded Age, no constituency that cares enough to preserve these enormous white elephants. These testaments to an age of inequality that we are supposedly done with, except of course we're not, we've just found new names for old patterns, new ways of performing the same hierarchies, new mansions being built by new billionaires in the Hamptons and Silicon Valley and everywhere else that concentrated wealth pools, and these new palaces will someday watch their own ruins accumulate just as Idle Hour is accumulating ruins now, but for now, today, in 2025, Idle Hour stands as it has always stood, a monument not to arrival but to the illusion of arrival, not to permanence but to the fantasy of permanence, not to legitimacy, but to the desperate, doomed attempt to purchase what can only be inherited, and the building teaches us, if we're willing to learn, what it has always taught, what we have always refused to learn, which is that the 11 months of frenzied construction were always the metaphor for the entire Vanderbilt project, that speed cannot substitute for time, that money cannot buy belonging, that the invisible labor that builds the visible spectacle eventually becomes visible in collapse, that the fire was not an accident but a revelation, burning away the pretense to expose the truth beneath, which is that Willie K. and Alva were never insiders, would never be insiders, were always and only performers in a play they didn't write and whose rules they could never fully master, and their daughter Consuelo, forced into her aristocratic marriage, trading her happiness for a coronet, would eventually write a memoir called The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952 when she was in her 70s. And finally free to tell the truth about her life, and the title perfectly captures the Gilded Age condition, all surface shine concealing base metal, all performance concealing emptiness, all that glitters decidedly not gold, and she described the misery of her marriage, the isolation of living in Blenheim Palace with a husband who treated her with cold courtesy, the suffocation of aristocratic life with its endless rules and protocols, the way her mother's social ambition had destroyed her chance at happiness. And reading her account you understand that the real cost of Idle Hour, the real price of those 11 months of construction and 20 years of operation and all the subsequent incarnations, was paid not in dollars but in human suffering, in the exhausted workers who built it, in the invisible servants who maintained it, in the daughter who was sacrificed on the altar of social ambition, in Willie K. himself who seemed to spend his entire life trying to escape from the trap his wealth had built around him, retiring to France to breed horses because at least horses were honest, at least racing had clear rules and measurable outcomes, at least with animals you knew where you stood, and perhaps that's the deepest irony of Idle Hour, it was named for leisure, for aristocratic ease, for the fantasy that wealth could buy freedom from labor and worry, but it was never idle, could never be idle, was always and only another side of work, of performance, of the exhausting labor of maintaining class position, and everyone who passed through those doors, from the Vanderbilts themselves to the servants who attended them to the Artists who occupied the ruins to the students who studied in the compromised halls to the current urban explorers who sneak past the no trespassing signs to document the decay with their cameras and drones, everyone has been performing the same essential drama, which is the drama of American class aspiration, the belief that wealth can transform you, that architecture can proclaim legitimacy, that if you build it grand enough and fast enough and expensive enough, they will come, they will acknowledge you, they will accept you, except they won't, they never do, not really, not fully, because acceptance is not for sale and never was, because the game is rigged, has always been rigged, designed to keep the new money running faster and faster on a treadmill that leads nowhere, spending millions on mansions that will burn, on marriages that will collapse, on social performances that will be forgotten within a generation. And the only winners in this game are the architects like Richard Morris Hunt, who designed Idle Hour and the Vanderbilt Petit Chateau and Marble House and the Breakers and Biltmore, who took their commissions and moved on to the next client, and the decorators and the craftsmen and the servants who took the money and understood that mansions are temporary but labor is eternal, that the Vanderbilts will come and go but there will always be someone else willing to pay for the construction of their own elaborate tomb, their own fireproof monument to impermanence, their own 11-month sprint toward legitimacy that ends, inevitably, in ashes and abandonment, in broken windows and stripped copper, in the slow victory of time and weather over steel and stone, in the final democracy of decay that reduces all pretension to the same level dust, an idle hour today, crumbling on its riverbank in Oakdale, surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs, with weeds growing through the terraces and water pooling on the floors and pigeons roosting. In the ballrooms, is teaching us what it has always taught, what we have always refused to learn, which is that the only thing worse than failing to arrive is succeeding, because once you're inside you discover that there's nothing there, that the glittering prize is empty, that all your striving has won you only a larger cage, a more elaborately decorated cell, and the 11 months of construction that seemed like such a triumph at the time, that seemed to prove that anything was possible, with enough money and will, were actually a confession of the very desperation they were meant to conceal, because if you have to build it that fast then you're already losing, if you have to force the timeline then you've already admitted that time is not on your side, that you're racing against the social calendar and the judgment of your peers and the certainty that new money's moment in the sun is always temporary, always conditional, always subject to revocation by the old money families who invented the game and still control the rules even from their graves, and so here we stand, over a century and a quarter after Willie K. and Alva embarked on their 11-month sprint to respectability, looking at the ruins of their ambition, and the question we should be asking is not, what happened to Idle Hour, but, what did we think was going to happen, because the story was always going to end this way, the palace was always going to burn or crumble, the money was always going to run out or move on, the family was always going to scatter and forget and leave no descendants who remember or care about. The Long Island hunting lodge their ancestors built in 1878, because that's what happens to monuments built on sand, to social positions constructed from paper, to legitimacy purchased rather than inherited, they dissolve, they vanish, they leave only ruins and stories, and perhaps stories are enough, perhaps that's all we should expect. Perhaps the lesson of Idle Hour is that the 11 months of frenzied construction were not an aberration but the template, that American success has always been about speed over substance, spectacle over stability, the quick fortune and the grand gesture and the inevitable collapse, the boom and bust cycle that defines capitalism itself, and we're still doing it, still building our 11-month mansions, still pretending that wealth equals worth, still sacrificing human labor and human happiness on the altar of social positioning, still believing against all evidence that this time will be different, that our monuments will last, that we can beat time and class and the inexorable leveling force of death, and we can't, we never could, an idle hour, standing broken and beautiful and doomed in the Long Island morning light, with the Connecticut River still flowing past it as it has for centuries, indifferent to human ambition, is the proof, the monument, the warning we refuse to heed. The 11-month mansion that took 125 years to teach us what we should have known from the beginning, that the only permanent thing about wealth is its impermanence, that the only reliable feature of social hierarchies is their cruelty, that every palace, no matter how carefully fireproofed, eventually burns, and that the workers who built Idle Hour in 11 months of exhausting labor in 1878 to 1879, whose names we don't know, whose graves we can't find, whose descendants have no idea their ancestors built this place, understood something that Willie K. and Alva never could, that time is the only true aristocrat, that authenticity cannot be faked. That no amount of money can buy what only centuries can provide, and that the desperate scramble to arrive, to be acknowledged, to be accepted, is itself the mark of exclusion, the sign that you don't belong and never will, and perhaps that's the final lesson of Idle Hour, standing ruined and magnificent on its riverbank. That the mansion's 11-month construction timeline was not a triumph of efficiency but a confession of desperation, that the speed with which it was built revealed the fragility of what it was meant to represent, and that everything the Vanderbilts tried to say with stone and steel and 24-karat gold leaf, the mansion itself contradicts with its broken windows and crumbling walls, whispering the truth that wealth always tries to deny, that nothing lasts, nothing is permanent, and the only immortality is in the stories we tell about the ruins we leave behind.